Hey, my name's Stephen Ward. I'm from Spokane, one of the pastors there, and I'm excited to be able to open up this new series with you, 9 to 5. And I was told I needed to sing the Dolly Parton song, but I actually want you to stick with me through the rest of this message. So I'm not gonna cause you pain already this morning. But 9 to 5, what do we mean by that? Well, we work 9 to 5, and we're looking into how can work actually lead us to worship. Can my work actually help me worship God? And so before we really jump into some of those principles that are going to be touched on over the next few weeks, I wanted to just kind of lay a foundation. So today, we're really going to look at holding your future with an open hand. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially when circumstances change so rapidly in our lives and things can be really, really good and then really, really difficult. And it can make it really hard to literally hold our job, hold our future, hold our lives with an open hand. But this ability, this perspective will really help us actually worship God through our work, through our future. Over the years, that will be the piece that will allow us to see longevity, consistency in our Christian life. So, how does that kind of work? Well, I wanted to share a little bit of my past with you. When I was in college, I went to a Bible college and I wanted to be a youth pastor. And when I was there, this guy named Doug Fields was like putting out books, and he was the guy, and he was speaking at conferences, and that's who I wanted to be. I wanted not necessarily in a, hey, I want to speak to thousands and thousands of kids at a conference, but I wanted to be that kind of influence that was making a difference in the lives of youth. And so that was kind of my goal. That was my aim. That's what I went to school for. And then I actually was a youth pastor during my college years and after. And then I got married, and my wife and I went to seminary, and I was like, all right, I still want to continue to grow in certain areas. So I'm going to learn more about leadership and how I can actually be a part of helping my pastor. And when we were there in seminary, God really began to shift my focus, but it almost caused a crisis. Like, I already had my future set. I'm going to be a youth pastor, and Doug Fields was kind of an older guy at that point for a youth pastor. I'm like, I can do this. There was even a guy named Richard Ross that looked like a granddaddy. And I'm like, if they can do it, I can do it. But then I began to have some classes about missions and read some books about missions. And God began to really do a work in my heart, and it shifted my focus. I felt like God was changing my future, and it really caused some turmoil in my life over that. I already had my future set. And then Karis and I began praying and sensing God might be calling us to something different. And that was really hard to wrestle through, to be willing to say yes to something that was not my dream. It had not been my goal or my dream. It was not at all what I thought was going to be in my future. But God began to alter that. And I had to be willing to say, God, will I actually surrender my dreams and my set future that I had for myself to you if you wanted to change it? Well, we began to pray through that, and actually took a trip to Africa, Malawi, Africa, while we were there in seminary. And God began to confirm in our hearts and in some other people as they were walking through this with us that God was leading us to Africa. So we sold everything we had. And after seminary, we moved to Malawi, right on the border of Malawi and Mozambique, Africa. And man, it did not take long in that heat before we realized Karis was going to be sick this entire time. Literally, within months, she has a blood condition where her blood doesn't flow properly in extreme heat, and there in Africa, it was extreme heat. And so she was sick, ended up at various times over a couple years having to fly to South Africa, get medical treatment, come back. And then we ended up having our first son, Brennan, there in Africa, and that even made her condition worse. Other hard things happened while we were there. Brennan got malaria and almost died. We were in riots. Lots of crazy things happened over those 2 years. And there were moments we would ask ourselves, man, what are we doing? And Why is this so tough that we move here for God and yet things are just so hard? Maybe you've asked some of those questions too. Well, man, things just consistently got worse for her health. And the International Mission Board had this policy that if you don't complete a first 4-year term, they send you back to America. And that was demoralizing, absolutely confusing. I felt like a failure. So coming back to America, we had literally moved there to be there for the rest of our lives. And now we're coming back. I felt like with my tail between my legs, just really struggling with God, struggling with feeling like a failure, struggling with, God, did I just not hear you right? What are you doing? Why did you take us there just to yank us back? And it was so confusing, so discouraging. And there were a lot of prayers, very loud prayers between me and God, with me just crying out to him, man, where are you in this? And why did you let this happen? Then we moved to another foreign country, Arkansas. And there we had 5 years of really kind of recovery and phenomenal time with the Lord and in ministry. And then that church sent us to the Northwest with a group. We had this redneck migration to the Northwest to plant churches here. And man, things didn't always turn out great there either. And we ended up after 6 or 7 years actually having to we got to see 3 churches start and helped another missionary that was a NAM missionary to the Indians be a part of our network. And man, God did some really neat things there. But at the end, it was really hard, really tough. And we had to close our main campus that I was a part of due to some hard things that some of our leaders went through or did. And so it, again, led me to this crisis of, I thought my future was this. And God, now we're closing a campus. I don't know what my future is going to look like. Why did you allow these things to happen? We should have just stayed in Arkansas. Why did we move out here just to see all of these hard things happen? Maybe you've had some of those moments in your life where you had your future set and this was going to be it. We thought we were, at that point, Pinnacle was going to be our church for the rest of our lives. We're going to continue to plant churches around the Northwest. This was what, God, you led us here to do. And yet, man, that dream died. And with it came some really hard moments in my life, some doubting of God, doubting of future, again, doubting, how can I hear you, God, when you speak to me? How about you? Have you gone through some tough things in your life? Maybe you have a future set. Maybe you're young and you're in school and your future is in front of you, but you have a plan, you have a goal, you know where you're going to go, you know what your career path's going to be. Maybe you're already in your career path and you're excelling and you're moving up and man, things are going phenomenal. Or maybe you were there and maybe something happened and you got fired. Or maybe something happened and you weren't able to get in that career that you wanted. Maybe something happened and it derailed everything you had set for your future. Maybe someone in your life is really sick and that's derailed all of your plans. There can be so many things that can cause our plans to fail. And it feels like a failure. I take that on as identity. We are failures. We failed. Or something happens and man, it can cause us to really take our eyes off of God and even question, God, what could you bring good out of anything that I'm going through right now? Maybe some of you are going through that moment right now. Maybe some of you moved to a new church plant and you thought everything was going to be sunshine and roses. And man, your team doesn't get along. Everything's so hard once you move to this next place. And I mean, so many things can just be derailed and it can cause us in our minds to go, I just don't know if I can go on. And we can want to run from these difficult experiences in our lives. Sometimes those dreams are just dashed. Our aspirations are gone. And we feel like, man, it's kind of hopeless now. I don't know my future. It can be very insecure in those moments. I want to look at a passage of scripture that's going to introduce Joseph to you out of Genesis. And we're going to see Joseph, kind of a snapshot of some of his life and some of his dreams, literal dreams and aspirational dreams, and see kind of this journey of Joseph trying to hold his future with an open hand through some really difficult experiences. So one of the first things I want us to think through is a lot of times when we have these dreams, these goals, these aspirations, we have very clear and maybe big expectations. Like, this is what I sense God is leading me to do, so I expect that X should take place. And when that expectation does not happen, it can really shock us and rock us and cause us to maybe even question a lot in our life. So as we look at this, God literally gives Joseph a dream when he's 17 years old. We're going to look at Genesis 37, starting with verse 5. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaths of grain out of the field when suddenly my sheath rose up and stood upright while your sheaths gathered around mine and bowed down to it." How would you like, you're the younger brother, and now the younger brother's telling you, you're the older brothers, that the older brothers are going to bow down to your younger brother one day. And man, they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he said. Look at verse 9. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. At this point, you might have thought he would have learned, don't share dreams with my brothers. It doesn't go well for me. But he continues on and says, "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Again, he had 11 other brothers. There were 12 of them total. And the sun and the moon. So when he told this to his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down on the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept this matter in his mind. Now, whether Joseph was arrogant and bragging, whether he just was ignorant and maybe lacked some social skills early on, I don't know all the motives of why he shared this with his brothers and his family. When I think most of us would look at that and go, I could probably guess the reaction that I'm going to get in sharing this. Nonetheless, God gave him this dream. And he has this future that's going to be in front of him, where he is going to be in a position of authority even over his family. Now he's 17 years old, he's young, he's got his whole life ahead of him. And man, I shared some of those dreams I had early on with you. And along the way, quite a few of them got either changed or derailed or really just kind of shattered in my life. And maybe some of you have had some of your dreams in your life shattered. Even if we're not talking about work, maybe some of you have had a marriage shattered. Maybe some of you have had a dream of having children shattered. Maybe some of you have had your future, your preferred future. This is what my life is supposed to look like, shattered. And it's hard not to grasp onto it. Like, no, I want this to happen. This has to be my future. It's difficult to hold it with an open hand, to be open-handed with God, with our future. So when we look at this, sometimes our current reality causes that dream we had back then to just go, man, how did I miss it so badly? And so let's look at the kind of current reality that hits Joseph about his dream. We're going to look in Genesis 37:17 now. So Joseph went after his brothers. His dad had sent him out to find his brothers, and he found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Now, we weren't joking about them hating him. Obviously, they're plotting to kill him. Here comes that dreamer. That dream, man, it had stuck with them just as much as it had stuck with Joseph. And they began to literally hate him. They said to each other, "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." Like, you think you know your future? We're going to shatter your future for you. And maybe some of you have felt that way. Maybe someone in your life has shattered one of your dreams. Again, maybe you have felt like a spouse shattered your dream. Maybe someone close to in your life betrayed you or shattered a dream somehow in your life. Maybe something just has happened that has shattered your dreams. In verse 26, it goes on. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. It's like, all right, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him as a slave. And you're like, man, that's good brothers, right? Even the closest brother is like, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him as a slave to the Ishmaelites. And it's just like, wow, how did we get here? But again, at this time, Joseph must have been tempted to really begin to question everything. He's now sold. He's dragged off in a cage by the Ishmaelites, and he's taken to Egypt. He's away from his home. And I can imagine that journey, because it would have been a pretty long journey, must have been absolutely devastating, hopeless, wondering, God, where are you in the midst of this? You promised me this was going to happen, and now I'm being dragged off. I'm a slave. What happened to my dream that you gave me? I felt so strongly about this was going to be my future. And now my dreams are literally being dashed under the cart of my prison as I'm being carted off, basically as a slave, as a servant, to be sold off. Man, where are you, God? Did I hear you wrong? And I've asked those questions. I've actually yelled at times some of those questions. He ends up being sold to a man named Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, actually the captain of the guard. It's a pretty important official, pretty important guy. And so he's sold to him to be his servant. And we're going to pick up in Genesis 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. Really? At some point, you've got to kind of question that. But it's interesting that that's a theme that's repeated. The Lord was with Joseph. And so he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted him with the care of everything he owned. Basically, he said, "You're it. You're in charge of my entire house." Man, this had to have been like, all right, we've got this yo-yo effect. All right, maybe this is the beginning of my dream. Maybe this is what God meant. Maybe this is the beginning of me being accelerated, and somehow this is going to be what pushes me towards the dream that God gave me. Maybe that's it. But Potiphar's wife begins to take notice of him and begins to try and convince him to sleep with her. And he's a godly man. So he continues to say no and push her away. And at one point, he actually leaves his robe as she's trying to grasp onto him, leaves his robe and runs out of the house. And so she's pissed off. And she tells a lie. She tells Potiphar that he came on to her. And Potiphar believes her. And so now Potiphar drags him off and throws him in prison. Can you imagine this yo-yo? You've been sold as a slave. Now you end up in Potiphar's house, an important official. You've risen up to be really in charge of his whole house. And now, so that was 17. Now you're 25 and you're thrown back in prison. Again, a dashing of what you thought might be the beginning or a reinstatement of maybe that dream that God had given you early on. What's he now thinking, sitting in jail, sitting in a prison? God, where are you? God, what are you doing? God, what about the dream that you gave me? How is this continuing to happen? Why is this cycle of failure, this cycle of even lies and people treating me so horribly? How is it that I keep being the brunt of all of this? That had to be some temptation. And so I wonder again, how do we handle this struggle? And did anyone else struggle in the Bible? Or is it just maybe No one struggles. And so when we read the Bible, we go, man, why do I feel like I struggle all the time, but maybe no one in the Bible does? And it could cause us maybe to feel like we can't relate. Well, thankfully, there are stories in the Bible where people did struggle. Very godly people, people very close to Jesus. Matter of fact, Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, who was the person that kind of paved the way for Jesus to come on the scene. He's at the end of his life. He's had this confrontation with an official and has confronted him about his marriage, and he's now put in prison and his life is now being threatened. And so he sends his two disciples to talk to Jesus. Look at Luke 7:19. Look what he asks. Now this is like, he's followed Jesus. He's been so dedicated to Jesus his entire life. And he even told his disciples, I must decrease so he, Jesus, will increase. His whole life has been so dedicated. But look at his words to Jesus. Are you the one who is to come? Or should we expect someone else? It's at the end of his life, and it looks like his dream is shattered. This wasn't what I thought, God, that you had for me. I'm supposed to be out preaching. I'm supposed to be out baptizing people. I'm supposed to be out continuing to pave the way for the Messiah. And now I find myself here in prison, and I expect I'm going to be killed, and he was beheaded. How can you make it through these incredibly difficult seasons of your life when doubts like, are you really Jesus? Are you really the Messiah? Or did we just miss it that badly? Should we expect somebody else? And then look at Psalms. David. I love David because he's so transparent, so honest, brutally honest. And he again was a kid at 15, anointed to be king, and had to wait over 15 years to actually see that accomplished. And he lived most of his life on the run. People were constantly trying to kill him. And in one of those situations, he cries out to God. My God, this is Psalm 22:1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer by night. But I find no rest. Man, just feels alone. You promised I was going to be king. 15 years later, I'm hiding in a cave. God, what happened? Did I just miss it? Did the prophet who anointed me miss it? And my dreams are just dashed. But the temptation is, God, where are you? And God, what happened to that dream? And do you love me? Why have you forsaken me? Why aren't you with me? It's difficult to trust when our failures look like they've been just destroyed, or our dreams have been destroyed in front of us. How did Jesus respond under immense pressure and stress? Look at Matthew 26:38. Jesus was struggling with what he's getting ready to face. He knows he's getting ready to be hung on a cross. He knows he's getting ready to, for the very first time ever, be cut off from his connection with his Father. And he says this in verse 38. Then he said to them, he's talking to his disciples, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little further, he fell on his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me. May this cup be taken from me. Like, I don't want what I'm getting ready to face. Jesus is saying, God, if you can, could you change this future? I don't want to face what's coming in front of me. Even Jesus is struggling with what he's getting ready to face. He's not in sin, but he's struggling with what he's getting ready to encounter. You and I, if these men struggled with what they faced, you and I should expect that we're going to struggle when things get really hard. It's going to be difficult to hold our future with an open hand throughout our life. So, I shared some of my struggles. Man, we had great experiences, and then Africa was really hard. We went and we felt like we were yanked back. God, where are you in that? What good came out of that? Why did I feel like that was a dream that just got completely destroyed? And then we move here to the Northwest to start churches, and we start Pinnacle Church, and it becomes 3, and we want to see a church planting movement take place out of that. And then due to some things that happened, that dream got absolutely shattered. How do you deal with your own struggles? How do you deal with your shattered dreams? How do you deal with your doubts? How do you deal with those times in your life where it feels like, God, I'm crying out to you, but you don't hear me during the day, you don't hear me at night, and it seems like you don't hear me at all? How do we make it through those situations? Thankfully, the story doesn't end there with Joseph sitting, rotting in prison. So we're going to look there at Genesis 39, starting with verse 20. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. Again, it's a theme. It doesn't look like God is with him. It doesn't look like God's favor is on him, but because he keeps going through these hard things, but God was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So, why and how does Joseph continue to be able to reset? How can he go through these ups and downs and continue to lean into the Lord is with me? The Lord is, how does he not just give up and say, forget it, God, you're not with me, I'm done? Look as we go through this. It took 13 years for God to eventually really answer his dream. So through this series of events, God had given him an ability to interpret dreams. Joseph now finds himself literally standing in front of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh has had a dream that no one else can interpret. And someone remembers Joseph can interpret these dreams. And they bring Joseph out of prison and put him in front of Pharaoh. And he's able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And he helps him understand what's getting ready to come as a famine. And we need to prepare your nation. Your nation needs to be ready to make it through this famine. And so Pharaoh, 13 years later, after his first dream, Pharaoh now puts him in charge. He's now 30 years old, puts him in charge of, he's second in command of the entire nation of Egypt. He's finally seeing that dream accomplished. Now, the roller coaster has been all along. Who knows what's around the corner? But at this point, God looks like he's put him at a point where he's answering his dreams. And then one day his family arrives seeking help during that famine. They don't know who Joseph is. All they see is this important official in front of them, and they're ushered to them to ask for aid during the famine, and yet they're there bowing down before Joseph. And it's the completion of that dream that God had given him 17 years ago. What was going on? How did he have that perspective? How could he look at them and not immediately be bitter even for what they did? How can he continue to lean into God and see God's dream continue to go, even with all the twists and turns through it, and not lose heart, not become bitter, not just live in hatred of his brothers and everyone else who'd wronged him? I want you to hear this phrase. The way we view God's presence and plan will directly impact how we view our circumstances. Let's say that again. The way we view God's presence and plans, not my plans, but God's presence and plans, will directly impact how I view my circumstances. Every single time Joseph faced this next challenge, he had to reset his head and his heart to say, God is with me. I believe that's true. And God has a plan, and I'm going to trust it. I trust God that he's with me, and I trust his plans, even over my own. And even when it looks like the dreams that I thought he gave me are destroyed, I still trust God and his plans. It helped him even in that moment when he faces his family. Love them, not hate them. We see his heart in an ability to worship God and trust him come out as he reveals himself to his family in Genesis 45, starting with verse 3. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" Now imagine, 17 years ago, you thought you were selling your brother never to see him again, and now he's the next to Pharaoh, the most important man in all of Egypt. And he has the authority to hold your life in his hands. And this is his ability to enact revenge. They must have thought, oh crap, it's over for us. We're not going to get aid. We're not even going to survive this. We're probably going to end up dead. And he asks about his father, but they're not even able to answer because they're terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save the lives that God sent me ahead of you." It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. How do you have that kind of perspective when your brothers sell you as a slave because he trusted God's presence and God's plans over his own? He held his future with an open hand. For 2 years now, there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping, but God sent me. They sold him, but he viewed it differently. He held his future with an open hand. He understood God's plans. God's sovereignty was over everything else, and that kept him steady through all the circumstantial ups and downs and roller coasters in his life to say, God was sending me. God sent me ahead of you to preserve you, a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. Man, what a mature perspective. A difficult perspective to keep. I realize that. I'm like, how do we, in the middle of our hurt and pain and tragedy and failure, how do we keep that kind of perspective? Joseph allowed the consistency of his relationship with God to impact his expectations of what was to come. You see, he didn't allow the circumstances to be the main thing in front of his eyes. And it wasn't the people coming at him, hurting him. That was the main focus in his life. His main focus was God's presence and God's plan. And man, if I can keep on a daily basis my focus on God's presence and God's plan, even when my plans that train runs off the track with my future, and I keep my eyes on God, then I can understand that God can even use those bad things for his good plan. Sometimes that looks impossible. And that's where trust has to come in. David has an example of this. David, who's running for his life most of his young adult life, in Psalm 31:13 cries out. David, after crying out, "God, where are you?" in another psalm, David's trust during his struggle comes out. And he says this in verse 13, "For I hear many whispering, terror on every side. They conspire against me. They plot to take my life, but I trust in you, Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hands." What? Man, my times? Like my life, God, is in your hands. My future is in your hands. Another translation says, "The course of my life is in your power." Man, if I can literally live like that, man, that's how those missionaries can live as immortal. When people are coming at to hurt you and harm you, you understand that nothing can derail the plan unless it is God's plan. So if I'm trusting in God, his presence and his plan, then I can trust you, Lord. You are my God, and my time, my future is held eternally in your hands. No matter what happens, I know it's not out of your control. Even in his immense struggle, which we read earlier, Jesus gives this incredible example of trust. 39, again, going a little further, he fell on his face to the ground and prayed, "Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me." But that wasn't the end. He said, but yet not as I will, but as you will. You see, there was a trust in his Father's presence and his Father's plan. And no matter what, even when he was so stressed and so anguished, so distressed that it was like he was sweating drops of blood, he trusted God's presence and he trusted God's plan. And he was able to obediently walk into an unknown future. The way we view God's presence and plans directly impacts how we view our circumstances. Do you believe that? Are your eyes right now more focused on your circumstances or God's presence and God's plans? Because it will really impact how you view your future. I shared earlier about some of my derailed plans. Now, I'm a little older than a lot of you. I'm a lot older than a lot of you. And so sometimes age can give a little bit of perspective. And I realize that. Sometimes some of you are like, my perspective it's not very long in my ability to see God really work sovereignly through some difficult things. Well, I have some perspective to look back on. And so if I hadn't gone to seminary, I might not have had God prompt me in missions and Karis and I feel that call to go overseas to missions. If I hadn't gone to Malawi, if we hadn't gone to Malawi and suffered through some of the things we suffered through, we wouldn't have met the missions pastor from Arkansas. And when we came back, we wouldn't have probably landed in that church in Arkansas. And if we hadn't gone to that church in Arkansas, where they were constantly sending out church planters, we probably wouldn't have come to the Northwest to plant Pinnacle Church. And if we hadn't come to the Northwest to plant Pinnacle Church and see what God is doing through Resonate and Keith be on the board of directors of our church from the very beginning, I probably wouldn't be standing here in front of you today as a part of Resonate. See, I can see even through the ups and the downs and the hard and the painful, I can see God's presence and God's plans orchestrated through my life. It's not that when I was in the middle of all of those, I enjoyed it, I liked it, or I wanted to be there. And sometimes I was crying out, God, I just don't see your plan. And sometimes that's where a rear view mirror helps our perspective. But I can look back and see God's sovereign plan moving along, even in the highs and even in the incredible lows and hardships. God's presence and his plan were never shaken. How about you? Are you able to step out of the painful circumstance enough to see God's presence and maybe that there's a plan and how he wants to use you? Could a failed business actually be more successful for God's plan in your life? Are you able to hold your future with an open hand enough to actually maybe allow that to happen and say, God, I care more about your presence and your plans than my own? I know that's extremely difficult to even say, much less be willing to say, yes, I would allow my future to totally be in God's hands, even if it meant failure, even if it meant pain, even if it meant hurt, even if it meant hardship. What if through your failures, God's plans would actually be enacted to save more people, accelerate his kingdom, to show God's glory more through your life, through hardships than your successes? I think sometimes we get the wrong impression in America that the only way God's glory can be seen in us is through our great successes, and that in our failures, God can't show himself or be seen as good and as God and great. It's actually the opposite. You see, it was Joseph's consistency in those difficult times that proved himself to people more than in the great times. And the same is true in our lives. I want to ask you just a couple questions as we close. Where does it look like your dreams and goals have been wrecked? Where does it look like your dreams and goals have been wrecked? Just be honest. And maybe even turn to someone beside you and maybe be authentic and honest and say, man, this was a time that it felt like my dreams or my goals were just destroyed. Where are you tempted to doubt God's presence and love? Where are you tempted to doubt God's presence and love? Where are you tempted to doubt God's plans for your life? Does it look like he's just abandoned the plan? The train's just run off the tracks. Where are you tempted to doubt God's plans for your life? And what do you need to surrender to Jesus as Lord today? What in your life are you grasping onto, not willing to give up to him? What do you need to surrender to Jesus as Lord today to be able to literally give him your future? Let's look at this phrase one last time. The way we view God's presence and plans will directly impact how we view our circumstances. Don't allow your circumstances to cause your eyes to come off of God's presence and his plans, where the circumstances you become fixated on that. And if we can stay fixated on God's presence and his plans, we will ride steady through the ups and the downs, and we will be able to look back and say, God, you've been faithful all the way through to carry out your plans. They may not have been all my dreams, but you've been faithful to carry out your plans through my life, to show your glory, to use us to impact your kingdom, and to see people come to Christ. Man, I would love it if all of you, when you're 49, could look back and see again God weaving and orchestrating a plan and have a perspective like that to say, even though I would not have planned my life this way, I know, God, you have worked even in those toughest moments. Let's pray. God, help us hold our future, our dreams, our plans, our goals with an open hand to you. Help us be willing to surrender our wants, our desires, our things that we think have to happen to be fulfilled or to look successful, or to actually say, God, you have to do these things in my life for you to look successful or good. Could we just keep our eyes, God, help us keep our eyes focused on your presence and your plans, so that you can use us however you see fit, that even in our weaknesses, you can be seen greater and brighter in the darkness all around us. I just pray these things in your name. Amen.